So throughout this book that we're reading together, hopefully you're catching a vision for ministry and outreach that is very interpersonal, simple, and is really built on relational investment. There's another author similar to Michael Frost, the author of the book we're reading, by the name of Robert Lupton. He leads one of America's greatest nonprofits, Christian nonprofits, that works in the sphere of urban development. Here's what he says that's very similar to what you're reading in the book. Quote, "The fundamental building blocks of Jesus' kingdom are relationships, not programs, systems, or productivity, but inconvenient, time-consuming relational acts. The kingdom is built on personal involvements that disrupt my schedule and drain my energy sometimes. When I enter into redemptive relationships with others, I lose much of my capacity to produce desired results with a minimum expenditure of energy, time, money, or materials. In short, relationships sabotage my efficiency." Is this perhaps what our Lord meant when he said we must lay down our lives for each other in order to find new life? We come today to the fourth of 5 practices that this book is advocating for us. The second L, which means simply that we need to take the time and prioritize learning Christ. And that idea of learning Christ points us to a word that is essential to our Christian identity. And words really matter in how we view ourselves, understand ourselves, and what we choose to prioritize in our lives. Somewhere, depending on the poll you read, somewhere between the high 80% and the low 90% of Americans still identify themselves as believers in God. So let's admit together that that label is almost meaningless. It would be like calling yourself a Homo sapien. Congratulations, your bar is low. If you were still to ask Americans, do you self-identify as a Christian, depending on the poll you look at, the results would come back somewhere between the high 70% and the mid 80%, which then also means that too has become like a piece of bubble gum in your mouth that you've chewed too long and it has no more flavor. In our culture, the word Christian has become just as meaningless. Do you know, by the way, that the New Testament only uses the label Christian about Christ followers 3 times? And in church history, really, the group of people who use the label Christian the most is the Roman Empire, when they were talking about our ancestors in the faith. But see, a word that your New Testament uses over and over and over again in the Gospels about what you and I are is we're disciples. And a disciple, by definition, is a student or a learner. There's our word from the second L. We are learners of Christ. See, a disciple, if a student, then by his or her very nature understands that the teacher has something that they themselves lack. That through their own ingenuity or cleverness or wisdom or life experience, they still will not be able to access what it is that the teacher has to give them. That's why people traipsed all over Israel for 3 to 3.5 years in the company of Jesus, because they didn't have what he did, and they yearned for it. By definition, a disciple is made, not born. None of us start out as great disciples or students of Jesus. You have to build that, like your education in school, year after year after year, block upon block upon block. So no matter who you are, or even whether or not you identify as a follower of Jesus, that's okay, because all of us are in the process of being made. None of us are complete. To be a learner of Christ is to take up the mantle of being a student, someone who knows they need from Jesus what they lack. Jesus tells several parables, that is, stories with a spiritual point, about the idea of being a learner, a disciple, a student of his. Here's one of those parables. This is Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 26. Jesus speaking. Everyone then who hears these words of mine, let's pause for a minute. Where does this passage occur? This is the very last thing that Jesus is going to say in his famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. After he says this parable, there is a mic drop and he stops talking. So this is the last thing he wants people to hear after his 3 chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, of preaching to them. So when he says these words of mine, most particularly, he's talking about the Sermon on the Mount. So again, Jesus speaking, everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. Let's talk about the context for this story. Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount from a place that we actually know, up there on the left on the screen where the red X is. That's where Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, near Peter's hometown of Capernaum. You can actually go there. Heather and I, almost 15 years ago, had the good fortune of standing on the hillside where Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And you can see from the place where Jesus delivers the Sermon on the Mount the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, which is the right picture, the top right picture up there on the screen. Jesus is alluding to something in this parable that everyone in Galilee knew about. And it's very simply this: that the soil and sand around the Sea of Galilee is deceptive. It's deceptive because in the dry seasons of the year, it's very firm. So you would think, if I need to build a boathouse for my fishing boat, for my fishing business during the dry season, I'm going to put it near the shoreline because then I don't have to push my boat as far to get it into the water. This seems like a smart decision until the rainy season comes. And all the tributaries that pour into the Sea of Galilee make it swell. And that firm soil and sand that seemed stiff as a board all of a sudden becomes loose. And there are stories, if you go back and read some of the letters from the Roman governors of the region, of multiple story buildings being built too close to the Sea of Galilee by people who were relatively new to the region, and when the rains came, it was a catastrophe. Everyone who heard Jesus would have understood what he's getting at. Build on the rock. Don't build on the sand that will deceive you into thinking it's firm when the weather is good, but when the weather turns bad, it's going to crumble beneath your feet. Don't build your house on the sand, Jesus says. Human beings have a tendency to build our lives on things that initially look like they're going to hold true. And then when the storm comes, they don't. Heather and I have had the good fortune of living 2 places in the country where we've seen this play out in the job market. We spent 10 years in the upper Midwest. We knew a great many people in their 60s and 70s who had wonderful union jobs and could provide for a family. And yet, as the economy turned in the country and the nature of the economy of Michigan changed, all of a sudden those good union jobs went away. And their children and their grandchildren cannot figure out how to make ends meet. Yeah, that's a foundation that won't hold. We spent 8 years in Los Alamos, New Mexico, home of one of our largest national laboratories. And if you have a PhD in a hard science and you want a job that seemingly will last forever, go work for the government. Until the country goes through an economic downturn. And in our last year in Los Alamos, 20% of the workforce was laid off. And there was absolute panic in the town. Because this job that they thought would hold didn't when the economic storms came. Oh, but you can go a level deeper than that. All of us by personality have things that we try to cling to because we think those will hold when times get tough. If you're an overachiever, one standing right here in front of you. If you're an overachiever, you know what you think is going to hold true no matter what in your life? Your ability to succeed or achieve. And life is going to have a way of not cooperating with that. It won't. Some of you in the room are people pleasers. You want to make everybody happy all the time. It is impossible to go through life with that commitment always holding true, because there are just times you're not going to be able to. Some of you in the room value your ability to keep a commitment, and then you are absolutely devastated when once in your life, when things got tough, you didn't. And it completely undoes you. Human beings tend to try to build their lives on sand that is deceptively firm, but when the going gets tough, it gives way. But see, Jesus was being very specific. He actually said there's one particular kind of deceptive foundation that you need to be careful about. And that's that flimsy foundation of which we need to be wary is to only hear his words and not act on them. And I suppose the people who are probably at the most danger of falling prey to this particular flimsy foundation are you and me. Because you and I are the most familiar with what Jesus says. And over again, week in and week out, in Sunday school and small groups and sermons like this, we hear about what Jesus said. And Jesus said, that ain't enough. In fact, if you build your life only hearing what Jesus says, perhaps even appreciating what Jesus said, at some point your life is going to give way. And it will be found out for being as superficial as it actually is. Now, it's not enough to hear about Jesus. You have to act upon what you hear. The half-brother of Jesus, one of the first great leaders of the Christian church named James, some 15 years after the uttering of the Sermon on the Mount, said it this way in James chapter 1, verse 22. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers, who deceive themselves. It's very easy to be someone who listens to and admires Jesus, but in the end doesn't not just take them to heart, but figures out how to live them out in their life. James says whatever else that kind of person is, they're self-deceptive. They are pulling the veil over their own eyes, and they're not telling the truth to themselves about their level of commitment to Christ. No. The flimsy foundation that is perhaps most dangerous for you and me is hearing about Jesus and not doing anything about it. And Jesus says, instead of being someone who builds your house on the sand, you need to be someone who digs down and builds your house on the rock. And to be very specific to the wording of the parable, what that means is you need to be somebody who hears what Jesus says and then acts upon it. Because Jesus says that's the only firm foundation that will hold true. Now, I have to say, all over the Old Testament, God is called our rock. And of course that's true, that He is the foundation that sees us through no matter what tempest will come. But that's not what Jesus means here. Of course God is our rock, but what Jesus says is the firm foundation is your willingness to hear what He says and then act upon it. Because the more and more that you do that, the deeper your roots go. And the more impervious you become to whatever life's going to throw at you. I don't know what the weather in your life is like today as you walk in here or you view this online. Perhaps you walk in here and the weather in your life feels like the weather outside. It's pleasant for July on the peninsula. It's sunny. You enjoy the weather of your life at the moment. Great. You know what you need to be doing when the weather is good in your life? Hearing Jesus and acting upon what He says. Because in so doing, you are building a foundation without cracks that will hold when things turn ugly. When the next hurricane blows through. When the next thunderstorm comes with its gale force winds. You have to hear and act because that foundation holds. The Old Testament uses a similar metaphor about trees, like in Psalm 1 or Jeremiah 17, 7 and 8. That you want to be a tree who sinks its roots down deeply so that when storms or drought come, you still flourish. There's a person who comes to mind in church history for me when I think of this concept. It's the person of Eric Liddell. You will know Eric Liddell perhaps from the movie in 1981 that won Best Picture, Chariots of Fire. He's well known for being an Olympic runner who set a world record at the Olympics that year for the 400 meters. But he's also equally known for not running on Sunday, his Sabbath, so he had to change races. Let me tell you the part of Eric Liddell's story that you don't know, perhaps. Eric Liddell was born to Scotch Presbyterian missionaries. He was deeply devoted to Christ his whole life. After his Olympic experience, in 1924, he decided to follow in his parents' footsteps and go to China as a missionary. For those of you who are historically minded, what's about to happen after 1924? The Japanese are about to invade China, and World War II is going to break out. As a foreigner in China, Eric Liddell, as a Christian missionary, was incarcerated by the Japanese. And those who wrote his biography say this about what he was like while imprisoned by the Japanese, who were notorious for their harsh treatment of those they imprisoned. One observer said about Eric Liddell, quote, "He worked selflessly as a teacher, a prisoner representative, and a volunteer toting loads for weaker prisoners. This behavior even continued after he developed severe headaches from a massive brain tumor that went untreated." A fellow inmate by the name of Norman Cliff said, "You would always know where Eric was in the camp because, number one, you would see his infectious smile. Number two, you would always see his overwhelming concern for others. But maybe most of all," Norman Cliff said, "number three, he would constantly be reminding the fellow prisoners, pray for the Japanese. Because remember what Jesus said. By the way, he said this in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Eric Liddell in 1945 was holding the hand of his friend Ann Buchanan. And his last words to her were, "My life is full surrender." And then he slipped into a coma and passed away on February 21st, 1945, 2 weeks before the camp was liberated. That's a man who had a sure foundation. That is a man who didn't just hear the words of Jesus, he had been acting upon them his entire life. And when the great storm of being imprisoned in the brutality of a Japanese internment camp came upon his life for years, that foundation of hearing and acting held. And we know that through the people who tell us about him, his behavior and his attitude in that camp. And by the way, what Jesus is saying here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in this parable about sand and rock, this is the offer that Christian people are making to the world. We do not offer the world around us, "Come and be like us." We do not offer the world around us a solution to all of their problems because we don't have all the solutions to all of our problems. But what we do have to offer the world is Jesus. And specifically, the one foundation that he says will hold you through anything you encounter. Just hear what I say and do the very best you can to act it out. And no matter what the course of your life, what twists or turns it makes, it will hold you true. I want to finish today this sermon about learning Christ with a quote from one of the great authors on spiritual formation of the last 40 years. His name is Dallas Willard. He says, quote, "The greatest issue facing the world today, with all its heartbreaking needs, is whether those who, by profession or culture, are identified as Christians will become disciples, students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of heaven into every corner of human existence." Would you pray with me? Our Father in heaven, we hear the words of Jesus today, and may we act upon them. May we believe that it ought to be one of our highest priorities to learn from him and be his disciple. And that as we, in our feeble and fitful ways, seek to follow in his footsteps, we will find that the ground beneath our feet gets surer and surer. For he is a foundation that will never give way. May we be a people who are marked by not merely hearing Jesus, but acting upon Jesus. This we ask for the sake of your kingdom. Amen.